So I brought my baby up to work last week and he made the hour and 40-minute trek very well, so. And,
Hey, you wouldn't believe that, they're just a sack of potatoes right now. We went on a cross-country trip with a baby that's.
Did you? I was with my coworker, so I was like, we had to stop once at that gas station on 95 and 14 to feed. And my coworker has never had his own baby, so I'm like, welcome to this life.
All right, we can start now that Councilman Erickson. Jolene, we'll call the meeting order. Jolene, can you note roll call, and if you're able, please start the flag. I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Right, doesn't appear that we have anyone here to speak in open forum. So we will go right to our first item, the utility fund budget review. Mark and
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor and Council. As is kind of prescribed on our sort of budget calendar this month, the workshop is kind of set around the utility funds, and we wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of just back up and pretend you don't know what a utility fund is, and you kind of go and start from the basics again, just to kind of review what utility funds are, why we treat them a little differently, how they relate, if at all, to the general fund, and then wanted to review what our 10-year plan has in store for those funds in terms of rate increases planned, and give you our recommendation for 2026 to move those funds forward in a responsible manner. With that, we do, you know what, we should have the screens pulled up now that I think about it, because we have a PowerPoint presentation given the.
Yep, I didn't.
You wanna
Do
review
you-
these two screens without the big screen, or do we might use two big screens?
Yeah, I mean, the big screen will come up no matter, but
Who has the presentation? Because I didn't receive it to preload it.
do you want to send it to me, Mark, and I'll just connect my computer?
I mean, otherwise.
I can just give you a clicker, but
Mom, good too? Yeah.
All right, it's coming from Melanie right now.
okay.
So I'll just start with this. So we have three funds. So we have the water fund, the sewer fund, and the stormwater utility. Those are legislatively authorized by state statute. So there's only certain things we can have utility funds for. We can only charge fees for certain things. Notably, one of those things is not streets. So a number of times the legislature has talked about having a street utility. A number of times that idea has been shot down. League of Minnesota Cities, Metro Cities, a number of different organizations have been advocating for it over the years. I would be a strong advocate of it. I'm sure Ryan would as well. It's a bit unfortunate that we're left with the street just having to come out of the general fund. And the reason for that is just that we are unable to charge developers the way we do in sewer, water, stormwater for the kind of major infrastructure that goes into those projects. So, but it's been tested by the courts a number of times, and of course we slap cities on the wrist and say, don't do that. So for now, this is what we have of these three utilities. There's a couple other ones that are a streetlight utility. You can have sidewalk utility, a couple of other utilities that exist. But for now, we have these three three, and so, we're just gonna go through a few topics here, we'll give you an intro to the utility funds, we'll talk about how funds are spent, and then we'll go through the three funds themselves. This map is kind of small, but I think it gives you enough of a visual to say, I wanna remind everybody, one of the reasons we have utilities is that not the entire city is, are subject to these fees, right? And so the expenditures that come, and the revenues that come into and out of these funds, it's important to remember that they're not revenues and fees that go to everybody or come from everybody. They're really just a user fee. And so, again, the map's too small to get a lot of detail out of, but this is what we call the MUSA, the Municipal Urban Service Area. And I don't know, what do you call that, salmon color up there? I'm half colorblind, so I can't tell, but the core of the city, right, you can see that's sort of the existing MUSA that, in some cases that's just sewer, and in some cases that's sewer and water. So like the north and east sides of the lake, that's just sewer utility, it's not water, it's not served up there. The other colors, as you go out to the south and east there, those are sort of future boundaries of the MUSA. The MUSA is a term that the Met Council uses, and sort of we have to check in with them as we expand that and say, hey, we're thinking of moving this line out a ways, what do you think, so that make sure that they have enough capacity for us in terms of sewer. So again, if you look at what we're talking about tonight, we're really only addressing people in this colored area there. All the white area there, that is, these topics, I should say, the sewer and water fund does not apply to them, the stormwater fund does, I'm sorry, I kind of misspoke there. So again, the MUSA does not apply to stormwater, just sewer and water. So a utility fund is an enterprise fund, as I was mentioning before, collect fees from users. Stormwater is a little funky there because what is a user of stormwater? Well, essentially if you have land, you're a stormwater user because you create runoff. Most everybody has some sort of runoff on their property. I think the mental note for later is that, you know, some people have more runoff than others because they have more impervious than others. I think that's worth discussing at some point. Our current fee structure really doesn't talk about that or consider that much. It tries to in a sort of way, but it really doesn't do a great job. I think the future of the stormwater fund could be a little different if we pay attention to that a little bit more. So maybe a little bit more on that to come. An enterprise fund is a special type of fund. Ellie can talk to that a little bit more if you have questions about that, but you know, essentially it is meant to be a self-sustaining fund, operate in their little silos as much as possible. Certainly there's a lot of overlap with using city employees and equipment across departments and across these utilities, but for the most part we try to account for that in our accounting systems. So in bigger cities of the first class and such, they will have a whole separate entity, the St. Paul Regional Water Service, right? You hear about Minneapolis Parks Board or something, you know. There's a separate total entity that runs these utilities in other cities. In a city of our size, it's just a utility fund set up within our accounting systems. The water utility, you know, our goal here is to provide uninterrupted supply of high quality drinking water. That's a choice that the city made a while back to have what I would call high quality water. Certainly, without the treatment plants, you can provide good and reasonable quality water. We made a choice to have these treatment plants to have a softened water that is, you know, helps with staining and odor and taste and that kind of thing. And so we have that. I think there's room for discussion there. Even Dave and I were talking today and Abby about other areas of the city that aren't currently served with water. How would that be done? Would we do it to the same degree that we do this system that we currently have? It may or may not be feasible to serve other areas of the city with the same quality and quantity of water. One thing the water utility also does in all of our areas that we cover is it provides fire flow. So we have enough pressure and volume to fight large fires in our area that's served by water. Again, that's a choice. There's no law that says you must do that if you provide a water system. Lots of cities, or at least areas of cities, rural communities, decide to simply have a drinking water system. If you go through Iowa, you'll see these weird, columns, like let's say a water tower with a bulb on it. Those are rural water system towers, that's creating pressure, but there's, just don't need the volume that you need in a big bulb like that, right? So they have little, low, small diameter water mains all over the place, and rural people have water, but they don't have a fire protection, right? That's a choice that can be made as a community to do that. Most urban, suburban communities choose that as long as you make the investment in a water system, might as well have fire bill. I would say it's not that simple financially, it's a lot, there is a pretty good chunk to have that available, right? But it also helps folks with their insurance rates substantially to have that fire protection. And of course, helps us keep village coming down. The stormwater utility, provides for operation and maintenance of improvements related to stormwater system throughout the, throughout stormwater utility fee. This is charged to all property owners. We sort of have a residential equivalent unit that we charge on. So basically one house, one REU, sometimes we call them REFs, I think, in the fee schedule. We do have an escalator for commercial properties based on the number of what's called SAC units, so it's really based on the amount of water you use. That comes from the Met Council, has a formula to charge people based on how much water they're using. To me, it's a terrible apples and oranges comparison. And other communities do utilize different systems to charge stormwater fees to commercial properties, and I think that's something we should explore in the future. It is a heavy lift to get there, and it will not be popular among business owners and stuff like that. But I think it's a much more equitable system that makes some sense out of why are we charging the stormwater fee in the first place. So if you can imagine the big box stores, Target, Walmart, have these giant parking lots and have a lot more runoff than, you know, mom and pop shop that, you know, Walmart doesn't use that much water, compared to like what a normal small restaurant would use. Yet that small restaurant and the Walmart might have the same stormwater charge because they have the same amount of water usage, which again doesn't make a lot of sense.
But they've already, some of these newer buildings, they've been paying through ponding and those expensive, so they're kind of handling their own.
Yeah, and that is usually the first counter argument is that, hey, we got our own ponds on our own site. Yep. And then there's something to be said for that. And sometimes fee structures will acknowledge that, give some credit for that, but there's always a downstream spot too, and there's also the acknowledgement that we as the MS4 permit holder are responsible to make sure that they're responsible with their infrastructure. So just the other day at a meeting with the watershed, we were discussing one of the big boxes, storm ponds, and how you just look at it and go, there's something right here, we gotta probably look at cleaning this up and getting it back to the way it should be. So we do have some responsibility to make sure that they are doing their job.
Can you explain a little bit the MS4 and how that, because that's what started these stormwater funds, right?
Yeah, really, to be honest, yes, I mean, I think Dave would tell you, you know, we should see had probably more staff just like dedicated to applying on the MS4 permit. So, really wanna back up, this goes back to the Clean Water Act and what they call it, a non-degradation, standard, which means they drew a line in the sand, said, from here on, we cannot pollute. And, so any pollutant needs to have a license through the PCA. So stormwater, so anything besides pure water is regarded as a pollutant. Even water at a different temperature is a pollutant, right? So cities needed to, all of a sudden, every city that has a culvert or a pipe of any sort, anywhere where waters of the state gathered, some court cases have even said curb and gutter is a water of the state. Anywhere that gathers, the discharge point of that needs to be a permitted site. And so, just like you sort of had to see the old cartoons with the sludge coming out of the pipe into the river, right? That's the old, of course, industrial people need a permit to send that sludge into the river, right? We have the same thing, it just feels a lot different because it's stormwater, I feel like pollution, but it is, due to pollution, so we need a permit to do that. And our permit is the municipal separate stormwater system. And there's a checklist of, we were fortunate enough in Centerville to be audited, on all 6 minimum control measures. And the checklist alone was 24 pages. So that wasn't our submittal back to them in terms of compliance. The checklist itself is 24 pages. So when you start to think about the burden, right, wrong, or different, the burden that puts on our staff to comply with 24 pages worth of regulation, you can imagine the cost implications of that, not just in terms of manpower and administrative power to do that, but the physical things that go along with it. So a couple of things that it entails are checking and cleaning out inlets and outlets on an annual basis. Every 5-year rotation day, we check our ponds for depth of sediment and make sure that they're functioning properly. At some point, you have to dredge your ponds up. That is like the 800-pound gorilla that really no city is actually planning for, because it would bankrupt every city if we had sort of on the regular cycle that people think these ponds fill up, which is like a 25-year cycle. You're supposed to dredge them out, haul that away to the landfill. It doesn't meet enough regulation to just be spread on a farm. I'm getting in the weeds good. So I think the point was, Mark, tell us about all the expenses that go into this fund.
Yeah.
And right now, I will tell you that just a fraction of those things are being paid for by this fund, and really it needs more revenue at some point in time. And it's surviving now, and it's doing okay because we haven't really ramped up things that should be in there, and so we're probably disguising the needs there by putting a lot of those things on the general fund, and or just blinders on a little bit, to be honest, in terms of the looming thing of pond dredging or other things like that.
Somewhat like sweeping, is that?
Yep, street sweeping is being paid up from out of there, anything sort of to do with water quality. And so Dave and I were talking, I think we bought the street sweeper out of that fund, it was grant funded partially at least. But at some point, we'll have to replace that thing, we're gonna replace it out of there, or it's gonna come out of the equipment fund, which is out of the general fund, right? So there's lots of things that are probably covered either by the street fund, or the equipment fund, or the general fund levy, budget basis that could be accounted for under the stormwater fund.
Because I think the replacement of that street sweepers in capital improvement fund, if I recall,
Yeah.
Are we doing any auditing to kind of be able to tell the story of how much the general fund or capital improvement fund is supplementing this fund? Moving to 5-year basis or something?
I mean, we certainly could pull those numbers and figure that out. I don't know that we're actively doing that.
I don't think it's in the capital.
You don't think it is? But certainly we could tell that story.
I think at some point it'll be important to.
Yep.
Maybe not this year.
So, that's the stormwater fund. I could, as you saw, I can go on for hours about that. The sewer fund, pretty self-explanatory. Again, cover a little bit more of the city than the water fund does, because we have more people on sewer than we do water. Most of the lake is sewer, lakes are sewer. And it's a big fund because we have a very flat city, and flat is not good for a crappy sewer system. It makes it expensive and hard to run, and there's not much you can do about that. You can't put bills in your city just for fun. So, so that's our brief overview of the utility funds. There's a lot of information here. I'll hit the highlights. The 10-year, bullet number 2 there, the 10-year financial plan had us funding, increasing the water rates by 6% on an annual basis, kind of in perpetuity. The sewer at 3%, and the stormwater fund at 6%. Again, each year throughout the 10-year plan. The graph there is just showing some of the operating costs versus capital costs. You can see how much the capital costs just dwarf the operating costs in these funds. That was the purpose of this graph, is really just to show how big of an expense those capital costs are compared to the operating costs of those funds. Now, that's a little deceptive because that's the expenses. I'm not showing the revenues here, which would be bond funds. So it levels out, of course, quite a bit in terms of spike in actual revenue need because we would bond for some of these big things and pay it back over time. But I wanted to kind of point out the magnitude of those expenses. So what you see on the left side is the sewer and water funds, each with their portion of the public works building. And then, the spike there at the middle or to the right is the water treatment plant that would be put online, in the early 2030s. And that's really dependent on growth. A couple of those spikes in the water fund, that second spike you see, is also an additional water tower, again, very dependent on growth. So some of these things are real tough to put in a capital improvement plan because they don't obey the passage of time. They really obey the building of homes. And so good news is that those expenses can be pushed out if revenues don't come in, right? And so, or you could say, if revenues come in, they can get pushed up because the revenue will be there to offset some of those costs. That's because we charge connection fees for these utilities. I think I explained my way through most of that. Just the other thing to note, of course, should be obvious, but operating expenses in all these funds rise just like anything else in terms of inflation and other factors.
So I noticed that in the packet, in the plan to increase expenses at 4% versus say inflation, which is historically been around closer to 2. What's driving that 2x factor?
Yeah, sure.
So the 4% is based off that 10-year plan that was put in front of you, and so that was based off of conversations with Ellers and what they're seeing. And so what we're seeing right now is that basic 2%, but they recommended based off with the stability of the economy versus all of these other factors. The 10-year plan, I would say, would be worst case scenario minus that public works building as we're still working through that, but that was the thought process with the 4 versus the 2. And then, like Mark was talking about, when these revenues are all revenue dependent, we were having the conversation of, does this graph even make sense as everything is so revenue dependent? But there is a lot of things going on that as we get to those years, we would look to reevaluate, does that 2, does that 4, what actually makes sense as we build a budget for the next year? But really focusing on, here's what we're using for guiding consistent principles as we move on to the future.
Yeah, and I think, I know it's been there 4% for years or since we've been looking at it. It's the one thing that I've become very aware of sitting in the seat for the last 2 years is that all of these decisions are policy driven. I have conversations all the time with fellow business owners in town who are, can't stomach the idea of another double-digit increase, and they're like, if I have a bad year, I won't spend money on a truck. I'm like, yeah, you're absolutely right. And in a good year, you buy 2. Like, you get to make that decision. But we aren't, as a body, driven by tax incentives or tax mitigation, like a business owner is. It's just simply purely policy. So I just wonder, is it worth conversation, is 4% the right policy to use in that and driving that? Maybe the answer at the end of the day is yes. I'm just curious.
I think the other thing that I've seen over the years, I've been around long enough now to see the ups and downs of the economy. 2% might be a consumer price index, a construction cost index. In fact, we just looked this up the other day because airport stuff I was doing, I can't remember, but the construction cost index is much different.
We're looking at it with that comparison to the.
There you go. Yep, and I think if you look closely at that, it outpaces consumer prices. I don't know, I'm not an economist, I couldn't tell you why that is, but over the last 30 years, the price of construction stuff has just way outpaced the price of local bread. And I think that is another reason that 4% probably still is conservative, but I would hazard a guess that the real number over the last 30 years of construction cost is much closer to 3 than it is to 2. So that's just my thought process there too. I've never My first 20 years of my career, when I was doing a lot of forecasting, capital improvement, so I've never used 2%. I've always used 3, maybe 4. So should 4 be 3? I think my philosophy on utility funds has always been, let's shoot a little high, and when we see that we're making money, then you dial it back. And I think you'll see we're not in a position to dial it back. So water funds, water rates here, 2025 rates. So most people in town have a 3/4 inch water service. Pricing is based on the size of your service. So it's the size of your meter, the pipe going in your house. Vast majority of people have a 3/4 inch service. You get sort of a freebie 5 units, so 5,000 gallons, a unit is 1,000 gallons. So the first 5,000 gallons you get for a low price of $41.55. As the base rate, you pay the $3.31 fee for the meter. And then so this is quarterly charges here, as you ramp up above 5,000 gallons, the next, between 5,001 and 15,000, pay $591 a thousand in the winter, and $650 per thousand in the summer. State law requires that we have a tiered water rate system, so that we disincentivize over usage of water, whether that's to irrigation or letting the water run while you're brushing your teeth. So we have this tiered system, so if anything over 16,000 gallons a quarter is at that higher rate that you see there, $619 and $848. And those monthly charges, quarterly per unit charges. So for someone using 11,000 gallons, and we did that math just because that was sort of the average bill. That is fairly low usage, but that's sort of what we saw in terms of residential stuff. The math there, you can see 4155 plus 6 units of water at 591 plus 331 is 77 bucks a quarter. So still I think pretty affordable. Staff is recommending an 8% increase in the water fund. We'll get to why that is in a little bit here for 2026. You can see that same customer would pay $86 a quarter as opposed to $77. This is a bunch of numbers, but the highlighted things are the things we saw in the graph before, those spikes, kind of capital. What you can't see here on the very bottom line is that those are red numbers. And so, yeah, maybe if you turn around, you can see it on that big map screen here. The red number at the bottom starts in 2027. That doesn't actually mean we're in the red, quote unquote, meaning we still have, so, laser pointer here anymore?
Yes. Thank you.
Let me just stand up here, I know we're on TV and stuff, but, so this set of red numbers here is how much we are under our target cash balance. So you can see our target balance here, 3.38, we're $291,000 by the end of 2027. We still have $3 million in the bank. Well, that's a lot of money. But again, our target is this. The target is based on the half of the year's operating costs. Is that right, Ellie?
Yep.
And then 100% of the capital, so the things we're gonna buy next year and the equipment that we're gonna buy, right? So you gotta pay for all of that, and then you gotta pay for, you have enough money sitting around to pay your bills on a regular basis, right? So to cash flow the operation, we wanna target this 3.3 million. As you can see, that's not a good trend. What is more scary though is here in 2033, now we're really actually in the red. So we're 2 million in the hole here. Up here. Again, a lot of that has to do with that water treatment plant coming online. And what we don't really have a great handle on is the correlation between, and this is maybe just me only being here 6 months, and Ellie just being here a week. Dave and Ryan might look at me like, well, we how many homes do we need to have before we put that treatment plan online? Certainly it's in the CIP at an appropriate time that we probably saw in some comp plan that we would hit that population. But I don't know that we've gone back and looked at that and what the revenue we generate and all that kind of stuff. We have a more generalized assumption up here about how many homes we're gonna build in the next so many years. We need some work over the next 6 months to a year to do that, but the good news is we have a number of years to figure that out, right? We have, obviously, we wanna figure it out before we get there. And, Ellie, can you remind me, are these numbers based on
So within,
6%?
yeah, so within your packet, if, those numbers were based off those 6%. So the main difference here is keeping 2026 where we want to go for a cash balance. So this chart right here reflects the 8% increase, and that is good for 2028. However, as we then go into, 2026. But then when we go into 2027 and so on, you can see that we're hitting that red for our target cash balance. And with that being said, Mark, Dave, and I have had multiple conversations in the 1 week I've been here of what actually makes sense for utility funding. How can we sit down and make this more sustainable? And so we're not thinking that the solution is going to then be to increase rates by astronomical numbers to hit that, cover that deficit, but really looking at it like we've talked a lot about just in this meeting alone. What does the restructuring look like? What does that make sense? And making sure we're funding things that will support the city and the city's goals. And so the 8% recommendation is based off of our 2026 knowns and how we can then continue to maintain what we know for 2026 will actually happen.
Is this, future years of red, is that going back to a 6% increase?
Yes. No, I'm sorry. So the future years of right here would be at that 8%.
So this is what it looks like if we decide to go from 6 to 8 and 8 in perpetuity?
Is this, this contemplates the public works building on here?
Correct.
And so have these numbers changed because we went from $25 million to 50 million?
Yes.
Is that why we're having this conversation?
Yes.
There's so much red here.
Yes.
What's the build out in 29? Is that the water tower?
Yes.
You see that debt service right now, we're sitting at $1 million, go to 1.5, and then exceed over 2 million.
Right.
It's 4 million.
Yeah, building on a water system is expensive, right? So I mean, actually, when you look at it, the public works building is about $6.5 million here in 2027 then. It's really not the primary driver of the problems out on the end of the, right, the water treatment plant and the tower are really more drivers of that as we go. I think that's good news because I wanna start promising to push those things, but those are easier to push. It just, we just don't have that problem looming at us right now.
The capacity standpoint on water towers, how much capacity do we have? We're spending.
How much can we hold or how much?
How much, I mean, like how many more homes can we bring online and not have to build a tower?
Yeah, it's a mix, right, cause it's not all homes, it's some commercial and it depends if you drop in an industrial thing that starts using 100,000.
Is it driven by how many hundreds of thousands of gallons we're projected to need? I mean, is that how you guys figure that? For project?
I don't know the trigger offhand, but once you start using that X amount, say if your capacity is 5 million, that you can pump in 24 hours, if that's what you can put out. Once you hit a certain amount, that your daily average is this, that's when triggers that you gotta start building another one because you don't want to. It takes 3 to 4 years to get it built, and you're anticipating by that time. It's too late for max. Just don't wanna get to the point where you don't have water.
Right.
Or can't, you have to put a moratorium on development because you can't supply water.
Water tower technology improved over the last 100 years?
Actually, Dave, I think will tell you that there's a day where we might go away from water towers, we have good storage in our water treatment plants. And the technology around pumping has changed a lot. We used to have hard switches, and now we use variable frequency drives, so it's a dimmer switch, for lack of a better term, right? So you can dial that pump up and down, the dimmer switch is supposed to either on or off. And that, the water towers are great for fire flow, so there's a fire, those towers will draw down very quickly, pump up full load of water, because you have that storage there, but, you know, on a day-to-day basis, they're not really needed in terms of supplying domestic supply.
Yeah, we don't use the towers for pressure, it's all on system pressure, it's run off of the sensors in the system that's turning pumps on and off, but the towers are just lower storage now and
This is a bit off topic, but the issue on North Shore Drive with the water main issue, is that getting, incurring the fire, they're pulling too much volume out of there now?
slime hydrants.
What's that?
Closing the hydrants
Closing
too
hydrants,
quickly,
yes. All the hard boys on North Shore.
so we're working with the fire department to review their operation. You can imagine right here,
Last what happened with that house was a different department that did it.
yeah, and, you know, remember that when we're fighting the fire out in Julie's, we're trucking water, so it's not like we're turning the hydrant on at the beginning of the fire, turning it off at the end of the fire, turning it on and off every time we fill a new truck, and so there's a little bit of that going on too, and, you know, you're fighting a fire, your brain doesn't always say, now be careful about how you jump in and close this thing. But it's a big deal, right? Yeah. Breaks, it's $20,000.
The water lines out there, the piping is quite old, I'm assuming.
That's like, it's all like, yes, but
Sorry, it's on top.
No, it's not off topic, I mean, there's more things than just growth facing us here, we got lead stuff in our lines that is, you know, it's all in the plan, and we're gonna replace it all, but that costs money. So, capital, you know, that, this is just an extension of what we just looked at, but this is a big capital cost. That $2.6 million in 2028, that is associated with County 32, right? Here, the 2028 and stuff, there, the 2.6 million. It says reconstruction project, so that's County 32. So, you know, whether that happens or not, whether or not we get any additional funding, from the legislature on that is a bit of a question. Lots of stuff there. Sewer is a bit healthier, quote unquote. You see the rates here. We used 7 units here because we have I'll call it usual, but something I did myself as a guy who's only been here 6 months. Ellie has been here a couple of days. We would scratch our head and go, why do we do this? And, you know, in conversation with Dave and other folks that have been here a little while longer, sometimes they scratch their head and go, yeah, I'm not really sure. So we have a cap of 10 units, so 10,000 gallons. So when you hit 10,000 gallons, you stop paying for any more sewage. So you get like free sewage flow past that. We think what the argument here was is that we charge people who don't have city water for their sewer, right? And they don't have a meter on their well, and so we sort of estimate how much sewer they're using. And at some point, there was an estimate put together, and there was probably some outcry from some people who were metered and said, hey, I know my neighbor is using the same amount of water, but he gets capped, and I'm punished for being on the system and having a meter. And so I think this is worth revisiting it. I'm sure there was logic around that decision at the time, but it's certainly worth revisiting. And I think just to be clear about this isn't just a cash grab to say, hey, we just get rid of that cap and make a bunch more money here. What we would do is look at offsetting the rate, so increasing the cap and then lowering the rate to make it a wash. Right? Does that make sense to people? So you raise that cap and make it a little bit more realistic, because right now, Arlie, were you able to pull how many?
Yeah, so depending on what season we're in, we see roughly 60 to 70% of people hitting that cap.
That really should be 80 or 90, we have a cap. It's sort of to carve off the real high spike stuff, right? It shouldn't be everyone shouldn't hit the cap, you wouldn't think, right? right? So when we had, like the vast majority of people hitting the cap, it seems odd. So I think it's worth revisiting. I'm not here to tell you, I got a plan to change it today, but I think it's worth a discussion.
How do we move people in our seawater?
So we give them a flat rate, so based on, I think, 10 units equivalent. So, let me just tell you, 10,000 gallons in a 3-month period is not that much water. For a household of 3, at 75 gallons a person per day, which is kind of the DNR's kind of threshold where they like to be below, that's like 20,000 gallons. So that's a household of 3 for 90 days. So, yeah, lots of room to discuss here. Cut to the chase, which is staff is recommending that we stick with the 3% that was programmed in. We think that that is still reasonable for this particular fund. We have a much larger chunk of the public works facility being funded out of this fund. Again, remember, we have 46 lift stations. A lift station is a pumping station for sewage. That is an inordinate amount of lift stations. That's a lot for a city of our size. And they are expensive, and they are hard to run, and critical infrastructure, right? If they go out, your basement floods within a few hours if Dave's crews aren't paying attention. So they're very important pieces of infrastructure. And it's why this fund has as much money in reserve and all that kind of stuff as it needs to, because you can see our capital costs, $1.3 million, $1.3 million, $2 million, $1.4 million. Those are likely, stuff dealing with either the force mains or the lift stations. And then we also have leaky gravity pipes all over the place, clay that leaks water into the system that's costing us money every time we let a gallon of that in. We pay for that gallon going out the door to Met Council. So that's the other thing, going back to the cap, is that we pay Met Council on whatever gallonage of sewage flows into their system. So if we cap people and don't charge them for the sewage over 10, then we gotta eat that. Now, we're probably overcharging those first 10,000 gallons because we gotta make up for the stuff we're eating. But you get where it's just more equitable if we would increase that cap to be more realistic, so that people are paying more equivalent of what they're actually using.
Yeah, some of that water that's flowing is potentially going to irrigate lawn. Obviously, it's not going to sewage. Right, or how do you?
So we know that because what we do is we set your rate based on the winter usage. So first quarter, whatever you use in the first quarter, that's your sewer rate for the rest of the year. So that you don't get penalized for irrigation water, because that is a big chunk, even if you lose that. So we do have a system there, but that is capped, and you have a capped rate you're paying for the rest of the year. Not much else exciting here in terms of big capital expenditures. We've done a lot, you guys have done a lot in the last 10 years in terms of upgrades to your lift stations and that kind of thing. You put a lot of money into the sewer system. It's a pretty well-oiled machine as far as it can be. It's just there's geographic and, certain things that are just, you got force main on the bottom of the lake, you got all sorts of expensive infrastructure that isn't gonna go away. Surface Water Management Fund. Again, here, we're recommending stick with the plan of 6%. Do you feel like that's a sustainable, I'm sorry, you want to go back quickly here. Bottom line. You can see the red numbers there don't start showing up until 2030 in terms of our cash balance. The amount we want to have in the fund, and you can see that the cash balance is higher than the water rate. We want to sustain about a $5 million balance in there. But we don't actually get real red numbers until 2035 again. And again, that's where we have to look at just the overall sustainability of this fund. But we think, again, we can mitigate some of that in coming years here and have a better plan going forward for those end years. But, so better scenario overall in sewer, but still not great news. Surface water, this is a quarterly charge of $14.75. As I mentioned, this is a per residential unit charge, so $59 a year. 6% increase would push that number to $62.56 annually. And as I mentioned before, I think there's an appropriate discussion here for what goes into this fund in terms of what we pay out of, what we pay for out of this fund, and as well as what do we do to add revenue to this fund. Here we don't have bad news in terms of red numbers. But that's because there's nothing allocated into this fund in terms of the public works building. So that $6 million is actually the JD4, and then you can see up from there, you can see intergovernmental $5.7 million in 2027. So that's kind of a wash there. So there really isn't a big spike there. It just looks like there is one. So you can see the news here is good, but again, there are so many things that this fund could be paying for to help our street fund, to pay for things that are looming that we haven't really budgeted for the way we should in terms of bridging and that kind of thing. There's just lots of room for, remember this fund I think is only about 10 years old or so, Dave, 13 maybe. So relatively new still for, when it was put in, and you're not alone, every city is around this. Let's just get it going and see what happens. And not a real plan in place when they put it in. They just sort of start to generate a little revenue, start to pull a few things into it. And we're still probably in that process of evaluating that. So lots of discussion, I think, coming up on this particular fund. So, summary, for the water fund, we don't feel like 6% is sufficient in the near term. Staff recommending an 8% increase. Sewer, we think 3% is still on course, but certainly we're reevaluating the future, the 10-year plan, and then stormwater. Again, lots of discussion, but for the foreseeable, for the very near future, a 6% increase seems reasonable for 2026. And then we can start talking about where this fund goes in the future. See what the future has in store for us. I'm gonna start with stop by. Joel, you know, do that.
I mean, I appreciate you answering my questions throughout, but I think those, they come out with everything.
I guess unfortunately, my opinion, we don't have a choice.
Price of business.
It's, that's the frustrating part about these 10-year plans, like we work through these things, we build everything to it, and then you're told, public works buildings will be X, and then we add 8%, 6%, and so it just, it's frustrating at times, but it is what it is.
Just like this one question I have, if we're gonna raise 6% on the storm water management, and I understand why you're recommending that, what's our timeline to work towards building some of those unaccounted for expenses into it, so we can actually say, well, here's why, it's not just hypothetical that we need to spend more money, bankroll for.
Yeah, I think what we would do is look to build both a case for the new expenses and revenues at the same time, right? So certainly people aren't gonna wanna see a 30% increase in their, stormwater rate overnight, and then also have these other expenses. And I think that conversation also has to come with, I know that the mayor has asked a number of questions about, can we do more out of the street fund, right? And this would be one way, is if there's an additional revenue source in the stormwater fund that is maybe underutilized. Because again, the other thing to do, and that Dave and I talked about a little bit today, and Ellie, is benchmarking our sewer, water, and stormwater costs against other communities. I mean, in some regard, that's either here or there. You've got a different system than other places. You've got 46 lift stations. Centerville, I know they're a lot smaller, but they have 4. That's a vastly different system, right? Centerville, not very big Centerville, but there's no treatment plant. You pump the water out of the ground, you get a little fluoride, you're good to go. you're chosen to have a water softening system. That's a vastly different system, right? So sometimes benchmarking is tough, but at the same time, when businesses are looking to come here, especially industrial ones, they wanna know what the price of water is, and they will shop that around a little bit, right? So you wanna be cognizant of that. Water and sewer, I think we're competitive still. Stormwater, we are probably on the low end. So again, if there's an untapped revenue there, perhaps that's a way to add more things into the street, project docket than we would otherwise do without having major effects on the general levy.
Yeah, on the stormwater one, it was Governor Plenty said a number of years ago, a fee is a tax. On water and sewer, at least you're getting good for that, like you're getting water and you're getting rid of your sewer, so there's that, but on this, on the street, on the stormwater one, there just seems like just an additional tax.
Certainly, it doesn't feel as good because you don't have control over what you consume, quote unquote. I do think there's value in it though, in terms of if we were to sort of charge that fee based on impervious or whatever, you incentivize people to think about how much pavement they're gonna put on a site, right? And, is that worth it to them? And, is there better ways to do that? I think one of the tricky things with that, as I implemented this, in other communities, is watching out for institutional stuff. We don't wanna tax a school district because they got giant parking lots and impervious large buildings and that kind of stuff. You don't wanna beat up another government agency, right? It is a way to look at other revenue streams from, churches and other nonprofits that aren't otherwise paying taxes, to, again, based on something that's rational, to get some revenue out of that, those institutions. So, different thought processes there. Yeah, you're absolutely correct, it's another tax by a different name, and that's a philosophical decision you can make to end the stormwater utility tomorrow and $1 million a year or so. Put that back in the levy. You know?
This shall be.
Be less shell and more transparent and just.
But we have to do it, not have to carry that fee based on
We do not,
states dictate.
we do not have to carry a stormwater utility fee. This emerged from that whole thing. Cancel it altogether. What you have to do is do the things that the MS4 permit tells you have to do. You have to have under storm bonds, you have to check the inlets, you have to, all the things that are, that
24 pages.
Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts? So this will come forward as
Yeah, we'll probably, so the idea would be to do all this January 1 in terms of rate increases, that's been our pattern, and then most cities do that, right, January 1, set the utility rates. So we would bring a memo forward in the next month or two here to say, going forward, we're planning on having these utility rates, increased by this amount, starting January 1.
Are we, looking at charging, like all these new subdivisions, are we charging an additional, are we looking to increase that hookup? What's the sack and whack fee, or what does that look like, and how is that kind of baked into this?
Yeah, we probably, didn't do justice to that part of the whole equation. Let's bring you back a little bit more information on that, as we go forward here in the next couple of months.
Cause if, I know you don't wanna benchmark, but if maybe we're a little lower on that, is there some room to add those additional hookup fees?
Yeah. Let's, I know Ryan and Abby and Dave all probably have thoughts on that. We did
And I know
not,
on the sewer end of it, more, I suspect a big portion of that goes to,
yeah, portion of it does go to my council, we have our own portion of that. We do as well, right?
Yeah, the Met Council gets their chunk, and then we have our own side. The problem with, at least the sewer side, is Met Council hasn't raised their rate for 10 plus
They have
years.
not.
They've kept it at 24.85 for as long as they've been.
But they have raised our costs significantly to pump it out, right? So that's how they're offsetting the balance, or budget. Which the argument for us should be, we should probably put some more on the development side that's upsizing your facilities and not all on our existing.
But we get that pushback, is well, my council's charging us 2,400 and the city's charging us 3,600, so we're probably at the top of where we can go without them trying to adjust it. Just get that pushback from them, you know, resident, why is the city charging more than that council?
But a lot of benchmarking done in the past for our lower end.
Yeah. Hookup fees.
Just something, and that helps.
Yep. Of course, the counter argument is if you want to be developer friendly and you want to attract good development, that, before they shop sewer and water rates, they shop that hookup fee, right?
And then last year, we moved water from 3,600 up to 4,500, so we moved that up $900 per year.
There was a very long time to see the rates, any of the connection fees, and we were crazy. And then once Dave came upon, we worked together to slowly increase the where we're at. Obviously, we fight resistance, you know, because of how it is related to developments. But if you go to a benchmark, I don't know, because even where we're at now, we were way low back when I did last, done a handful of times. Just where we're at, right? Then you go further north, you guys, and they're lower than you, so it's like, that's,
Yeah, it would just be interesting, but you wouldn't be able to compare what our systems cost with like 4 lift stations versus 42, but if they're shopping us around, it was comparable to what that is. That wouldn't use much development there, but.
I do think it's worthwhile too, especially because we see the drivers are the water tower and water treatment plant, and those are growth related, right? And existing citizens rates should not have to be burdened with those costs, right? So that's why you don't see us recommending a 20% increase, because Polymac, we want that 10-year plan to not be in the red. I think probably the solution to that is a little bit more on the hookup fee side of things. We did kind of brush over that, to be honest with you.
Anything else? Next item, weekend lighting options, right?
all right, on page 9 of your packets, my first page of the cover memo. I got 2 pages of the cover memo. We're gonna go through 6 lighting options that we've laid out with some pricing. Option 1. Which is on page 11 of the PDF of the packets. So that's the $630,000 that was presented in July 21st at the city council workshop there. That estimate was based on approximately 250 foot spacing, similar to what we've already done on Cascade Highway 32 at Edison Avenue, with some adjustments to get the lights at the intersections and stay away from the power lines. Columbus, as referenced, was proposing to do 150 foot spacing to match their existing lighting spacing that they got on that little stretch that they already built coming out of Highway 97. Lights are proposed to be behind the trail, outside the 2 foot clear zone. There would be a gap in the lighting, approximately 360 foot stretch, and a retaining wall area that's being proposed part of the project with that option. After that option was presented, you guys wanted some additional options to come back. We talked about some bollards and stuff like that, so just going into those. The first one, option 2, would include street lighting at the parking pier and intersections. Trail bollard lighting at the manufacturer's recommendation is 30 foot spacing, but if you kind of look at some of the maps that are in the packets, you can see what that would look like. Obviously, it's a heck of a lot of maintenance. I provided a picture in there too that of a project we did up in Chisago City that had spacing 25 to 32 foot. But just because of the amount of bases then you're now putting in at 30 foot spacing, that jumps over $1 million. And I don't think that's a route you guys would want to go down. Just one car going off the road there, you know, or somebody jumping stuff in the winter. You know, there's going to be a lot of places not to put snow out there, and it's going to be dealing with maintenance constantly there. So we just did it at a 60 foot spacing, same main street lights lighting the parking, pier and intersections. Trail bollard space at 60 feet, that's 690,000. Then we also looked at what, it might be at 90-foot spacing, and that was 560,000. Still a lot of infrastructure, probably not gonna get the most use out of that area as you would some of the other trails in town, just with the density you got in there in that time, you know, you need to get a lot of lighting too. Peak of the summer, you're gonna have sunlight till 10 p.m. Winter time, probably not gonna get pedestrian users out there just because of the nature of the weather. So then when we really dialed it in, to some that might be just, let's forget about some of the wishes, what are some of the wants? That's where we come up with the other two options. So street lighting at the parking areas, the bump out, when I say parkings, the bump out parking areas, the two areas that we have identified on the plans. The pier, fishing pier, and then intersections. Street light poles here would be 28 feet in height. These estimates are only including one service cabinet to serve all nine lights. So that option, we're looking at 280,000. That would be the blue decorative light. And then the lax option, which is a little cheaper, but this would be the Conexus standard lantern street lighting options. In the same locations as the estimate for 280. The downfall with this is Conexus this would be the only option where Conexus would own. Conexus doesn't want to get in the business of bollards. Everything else was decorative lighting or the combination of bollards. And that's why those would all be city owned. This one would be the black style lantern lights. These would be owned by Conexus, but by being owned by Conexus, they would have to go through the same process that we're going through for the license agreements, easements with the DNR. That could potentially be another 12 to 15 months before they would get through their own process. You know, if we started right now, right? So if they're, you know, the desire to do lighting, that's why we recommended it, obviously, to go with the blue decorative street lights, option 4A at the 280,000, and we would be lighting only the street lighting at the parking areas, the bump outs, the pier, and intersections with 28-foot poles. So those are kind of the options that we've laid out. Each of the figures in the package show location of that lighting, cost estimates. Funding source has not specifically been identified for that amount, so that's something that we'd have to discuss tonight too. And or if the project wants to move forward with those lighting, or is there other options for us? You want us to put together cost estimates or locations of lighting?
I agree with those. The bollards would be nice, but from a maintenance standpoint, the infrastructure would be not on that stretch of road.
So if, we don't know where bids are at, we couldn't use state funding for this, that 4.5 million, like, let's say it came in lower, can we use these dollars for that, if it does come in lower, or?
You could apply that funding, but I just really don't think there's gonna be excess funding from that 4.5 million to put into the project. I do think this will be city costs. I mean, we're gonna obviously know here in October when bids are open. But we're still waiting on that DNR easement license agreement. So there might be a potential that the city doesn't award the project without having that in hand. We try to delay it as much as possible, but you know, if we can't get that surcharge put on before frost sets in the ground, you're already pushing everything that was just bid to 2026 construction. Then the city might want to make a decision whether they rebid the project or if they want to negotiate with the contractor, because they're most likely should be anticipated they're going to have an increase in costs if work is completed 26 versus what would be completed in 25, right? So those are the things that are up for, you know, as bids come in, more information will be available. When would be if that easement's in hand, then we would know exactly where we stand. But with other costs associated with Gray River Energy, just some, original things that, their original estimate that they gave us in writing was $150,000, versus where the agreement is at $307,000 right now. And having to come in and get the guy wires, to hold the poles prior to the surcharge, they $20,000 for their engineering for designing the system and the $14,000 for the temporary guide wires. All our original conversations with the tech panel were we weren't gonna have to purchase any wetland credits at $0. And then it changed it was a big surprise to everybody involved. Now, and we weren't gonna be able to use the road replacement program, so now the wetland credit purchases are anticipated at $38,000. DNR easement that was originally estimated based on the lift station lease we just executed in the same exact area was $20,000, but now the appraisal comes back at $93,000. So those are the three punches that the project took over the last couple of years.
So, we did a neighborhood engagement on this project, did we not, right?
We had two meetings.
Was there any feedback on lighting, strong or either way, do you recall?
I don't remember any like, so when we brought that conversation in, I was obviously surprised to Public Works and myself because we were not accounting for anything with the project. The biggest discussion was whether there should be guardrail between the road and trail. Yeah, that's really what came up with all of it.
And the sound wall.
And
the sound wall.
In the
I mean, certainly the lighting could be controversial with lake waters, right?
Yeah, that was my comment.
Nowadays, there's always been shields called home side shield where people like to light the street but not their house. These days with the LEDs, they're almost sort of built into the light, you don't see them as much. So there's certainly shields you can put on. Doesn't stop people from having a perception that there is light pollution and that kind of thing.
We've talked about this before and go backwards, but I mean, do we want to light here or do we want to close down the dark at dusk?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think there's whether or not it's an attractive nuisance to have lighting in it. Again, I've advocated with Ryan, I thought, actually where that fish trap is, maybe we should have a light there just for security kind of. And Ryan argued that, well, you're just gonna attract people to that, Our public safety folks aren't here tonight, but I'd love to hear their questions. I would guess they would lean towards more lighting is better, but,
And my original thought about the lighting was to kind of be consistent with what we're doing on 33, 32 on Broadway. But maybe, to your point about the lake, maybe there's a strong argument to be made that we minimize it versus maximize it.
I know a question came up or thought was, what kind of lighting is already there with the freeway? Is that
none on that stretch.
Just might wanna also just check in with your Parks Commission. I think our current Parks Plan does call for trying to expand the operational hours of the park system, making it available, making park spaces more available in those off-peak hours.
so
For
will
people
this
that work.
become a park?
Well, no, but it's a recreational
Yeah.
feature within the community. So just that idea of how would you wanna, would there be that desire just to offer it? Think about even this time of year, but we're probably leaving the dark, at 8. It's not that late.
Any thoughts?
So part of that 280, whatever it is, forgive me for not going in depth on the diagrams, rather read a spreadsheet than the drawings. How much light are we putting in that parking lot for lake access? Any, or is it just the bumped out parking?
Just one right at the entrance to the boat launch.
Yeah,
One.
is that consistent with the other areas of Forest Lake in terms of public access?
You have, you gonna light it, the other ones?
No, DNR already has a light in the parking lot.
Inside.
Inside, it's supposed to just be at the magazine or something. But the trailers, no lighting, it's
Certainly.
Lakeside is lighting, but Lake Two, I don't believe there's a Lake Two.
Intersection lighting is definitely one of the very few things that does result in fewer crashes. It's actually correlating data to say that that's good for safety, traffic safety. So intersection lighting is always a good idea. And that would be fairly standard in any of our developments, I would think, right? New street lighting would generally be at the intersection.
Or in the cul-de-sacs.
Yeah, so just from a road perspective, it's probably good to have it there, right?
So if there's no funding, if we don't have funding, just we need to put this in levy for 26.
It would come out of the capital fund. I mean, my recommendation to you would be that it would come out of the capital street fund, you know, right? So no additional levy dollars, either it just means that it's gonna be,
280,000 less for roads.
that's right. Not necessarily in 2026, but somewhere down the line, right?
What was the lowest, what was the one with the black, what was that price point again?
260.
230.
30.
That's the only option that would be owned by Connexus Energy, and they would have to go through their own.
Yeah.
uh,
But then they would be responsible for the maintenance of them?
You would still pay a per whole fee that you guys do for they perform the maintenance.
I think for the 280 probably makes most sense. It's the most conservative without going, we're still carrying that thing throughout the city, and hopefully bids come in low, we can use some of the dollars there, and when it's not 280 out of, out of a fund, out of the capital fund, so that would be my thought on it.
Yeah, I'm not torn one way or the other, but
Is that 4B?
Yeah, for whatever.
for it.
It's 4A.
4A, I'm sorry, yeah, I had 4A.
Agree.
Okay. Anything else on that, Brian?
It's $280,000.
Well, do you ever, and maybe it was in the packet, do you have a recommendation?
Yeah, of all the lighting options, our recommendation was 4A.
Yeah.
It was pre-written.
I thought maybe your reaction would be more happy with it. Okay, I guess that's what we're. All right, great, thank you for all, thanks for bringing it back to us, these different options, appreciate it. Local option sales tax, Mark.
So, we've just begun some early research and conversations. The mayor and I have been engaged with our legislators on the idea of a local option sales tax as a potential funding source for public works building, perhaps beyond that, we could imagine other things. If folks don't know exactly how this process works or what this is, it's a sales tax, except the sales tax comes to the city, not to the state or the county transit authority or whatever. So I see from the memo, there's a couple of different portions of what you pay when you go to the store and you pay sales tax. You're paying a chunk to the state, you're paying a chunk to Washington County, and transit authority, that kind of thing. We would be tacking onto that, perhaps up to 0.5%, say. Could do, I think as low as 0.25%. I think they wanted to do it in 0.25% increments. So we've not done hardly any homework on this other than to know, make sure we understand the process. And the process is really sort of threefold. First, you need a motion from this body saying we want to do this. And in conjunction with that, you want to be having a conversation with your legislators that they will support this. It seems like the three of them, so that's Patty Anderson, Josiah Hill, and then our Senator Carmen Housley, all three sort of somewhat supportive, somewhat reluctant. I think they've all seen this go well and go poorly, probably again. So they seem on board if we're on board, and so you would pass a resolution, say, legislature, we wanna do this. Then the legislature has to authorize it, so it'd be a special bill just for you. Likely that is lumped in with a bunch of other cities that are gonna want the same thing. And the legislature is likely to either do all or none of those, or most or none. And the history is all over the place on this. Many, many years, it was, nobody got this except the big ones. They have St. Paul, Rochester, then a few years back, boom, 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 all of a sudden, you got a whole lot of folks. Then they went, oh, that was a weird thing, let's slow our roll on that. And now the moratorium has come off again, so this allows the legislature to do it again. Question is, will they have the want or will to do it again? And it's a weird political football. There's not one party that really is strongly opposed or not opposed to this. I think some people on the right maybe see it as a relief to property tax, which is not always viewed as well by the right. The right usually, if they like taxes at all, they would rather see it as an excise tax, right, a usage tax, rather than property or income tax. The left generally supports taxes in general and wants us to have a working system of stuff, right? So it's not a cut and dried party line issue, so very hard to predict whether or not the legislature is going to go forward with it. I think what our three legislators really stressed to us was that if you're going to do this and ask us to stick our necks out for you, we want to know that your community is going to support this and council by proxy. So I think part of what we would need to do if this group said out of their heads tonight and said, yeah, let's explore this a little bit more, would be to do some research about and try to get enough information so we can put this out to the public a little bit in terms of some community engagement, say, is this something the community would be okay with? Because the last thing you want to do is pass hurdles 1 and 2 and get to the finish line and go, oh, dang, didn't know the public was really going to shoot this down. That's what happened in Cottage Grove. I think we heard from their mayor and administrator that was a mistake. They really felt bad about how that went down. I don't think they lost by a whole lot, but it was enough. Really should have seen it coming. That really, put a whole dislodgement of their whole plan. So a couple of things we would want to know are how much revenue could this produce at 1/4%, 0.5%, and then how much of that revenue would come from people that don't live or pay taxes in Forest Lake already. And with some direction tonight, we would go out, get some of that information, come back to you with that. Obviously, the selling of this idea, if I could call it that, to the public, depends a lot on whether or not most of that revenue is coming from people in Forest Lake already, in which case you get back to the mayor's comment earlier about a fee is a tax is a tax, whether it's property tax or sales tax, if the same people are paying that, what's the difference? But if we show that because a lot of this would come from people who are visiting our city and using our services, police and our fire, and our roads, and our sewer and water. So it can make a lot of sense to taxpayers as well to say, hey, jeepers, we got all these other people coming here, and because of those people, that's great for our business community, but it's costing us money on police, and fire, and road repairs, and all that kind of stuff, right? So it can be a pretty sensible thing to do for your local taxpayers to take some of that burden off of them, put it on people who are utilizing all the things that we've got in our city. Oftentimes, the business community is one of the opponents of this because it just makes everything that they sell more expensive, right? So in fact, you got a couple of business owners on the council. You're gonna have to help navigate that conversation if that's the direction to go. So lots of, sort of political issues here, but certainly something worth looking at. Very ballpark, like what could we raise? It's in the millions of dollars. It's not just $100,000 a year or something. This is pretty big money, and would really will solve a lot of what you just saw, right? So
So if I can just add a little bit onto that, I think, specifically if we're talking public works building, this is the largest expense that the city has ever had and ever probably will have for the next 30 years is this building. And so, you know, to fairly be more equitable, it just seems though, since we are such a regional hub and there are so many people coming from all different areas, you know, within a 20-mile or 30-mile radius to do business, especially out on the freeway where these big boxes are, it just makes more sense for the burden to be placed on people using those streets that this building is gonna support. And so that's been kind of the reason why Mark and I reached out to all three of the state reps, and I think you can explain that too, and if it does actually work out where, you know, more people are out of town or paying for it, not just the residents, if you can explain that, I think it's gonna be an easy sell. Oakdale, just did this, and it passed pretty easily, when they went to the referendum on that, and so I think if we told the story, it would be a fairly easy sell. I hate using the term sell, but that's really, you just give support to that. Now, I will say though, you know, after we met with the three reps, Patty Anderson, who was on some type of a tax committee, met with the chair of that committee, and it sounds as though in 26, there still just is a lot of hesitancy for this thing to actually go forward. Blaine has a massive one that they're gonna be asking for their $75 million project down at the sports center. So potentially that would be helpful, because I'm assuming they're gonna be, you know, after them big time to get that project, or get that approved for sales tax. So, I don't know, Mark, is it, if the legislature approves it, all of them get it, or they pick and choose which projects they allow to?
So I believe they can pick and choose, but I think generally there's gonna be, you know, nature, let's all shake hands with us at the same time. You know, I think they're not gonna let one person's go. And, certainly if you put something out there and didn't make a great case for yourself, they would maybe look at that and say, well, you know, Blaine makes sense because it's obviously a regional thing going on here. Forest Lake would make sense, but you know, this other town, Beaver, you know, that's just a thing you have to deal with yourself. I think there could be some of that, but I doubt, you know, everybody can get to that.
And remember, do you recall what they said, how many requests there already are, you know, like 40 some?
Yeah, there was something.
It's a pretty high number, so that could help or hurt. You know, it's easier to say no to a bunch of people, or maybe it's harder to say no when there's more people doing it. So, personally, I think it's worth it. Really, that does save, you know, solves a lot of problems, and this building is way more than we ever anticipated it was gonna be, and so I think it's worth at least have staff do the due diligence to see what this might look like. But that's just my.
No, I agree. I remember when this was first floated years ago, I was not sure about that, but now I actually understand, and that's gonna be the key, is getting this, you know, the story out there, that people understand that this isn't just, you know, taxed by another name, but it's actually a way that is gonna help take the burden off everybody. Yeah, but I'll be curious to see what the breakdown is. I mean, I suspect that it's gonna be pretty favorable in terms of out-of-town usage, but
Well, just a couple of quick details too is, the tax has to have a length of time, so it's not in perpetuity, and it has to be for specific projects. So we could name other things, but it has to have a timeline and so they have an end date to it, and a project that you're funding with it. And that project has to be a regional facility in some way, shape, or form. So you have to make that case to the legislature that this is a regional facility that serves more than just people in your city. I think it'd be fairly easy to show that, especially when we show that there's a number, the amount of money coming into those places. Those people are coming into there, and the people equal cost to us, right? Yeah. So
How would we determine the end date for this project?
you would look at how much it's gonna generate, what the bond payments are, and just basically figure out, hopefully we would be able to shorten the bond from 25 years if we had programmed that, or 20 or 25. You know, we would probably shorten that bond a little bit and show that we paid off a little quicker.
As much as it'd be nice to find some other needs for that we can use, I just would hate to jeopardize loading up too many things and not get it. And instead of going after what we
I'm in favor.
Yeah, I wanted to just come and make sure that, Mayor and I didn't get too far out ahead of the rest of the group here and start advocating for something that everyone else didn't want, so. We'll head in that direction and get some information, and we'll get those couple of key pieces of information back to you, how much was generated, how much of this is paid by people at the park, paying taxes in those states.
So with that, I'm going to make a motion that we go into the closed session pursuant to Minnesota State Statute 13D.03 for labor negotiation strategy discussion. Second, any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? We're in closed session. Thanks everyone for your work tonight.